Welcome back to Leaders, a podcast dedicated to exploring the best leaders this world has ever seen. Before getting into episode 4, today's episode, I wanted to again invite you to visit our LinkedIn page that has been created. Episodes will be uploaded there as well as other content. We've now stood up also a YouTube channel which will house the episodes as well as they are released. I encourage you to subscribe to the YouTube channel, any of our other social channels, as well as add reviews onto your respective podcast player. Again, the cadence here is bi-weekly or weekly format, and I'm definitely trying to be honest with myself and stick to that time frame to ensure that I'm covering off on as many leaders as possible while also balancing that with doing diligent research on each so that this content is succinct yet very insightful with its format and focus on leadership and a lot of great takeaways from examining the best leaders, both past and present, which will lead us into today's episode. Episode 4, will focus on Lee Iacocca. And Lee was a renowned executive within the auto industry, namely in the 80s and 90s. And where I started my research initially was on a few of the books that he's written, of which the first one that really struck my curiosity was Where Have All the Leaders Gone, that he had written. But as I downloaded that and actually listened to it via audiobook, the first few chapters, frankly, really weren't what I was looking for from a leadership material standpoint. Frankly, he's very outspoken, not only with his leadership tactics, but politically as well. So that book really honed in on a lot of his political stance and criticisms of past presidents and so on and so forth. So really, in reviewing that material, I felt that his biography, Iacocca, was a much better resource for the type of material that I want to consistently bring out within this podcast. And so I relied heavily on the biography as well as other articles and notes that I was able to find within Lee's past. So with that, we'll just go into a little bit of where his rise to the CEO path. So Lee started as an engineer and he turned salesman and joined Ford Motor Company first in 1946 and eventually was named president in 1970. However, in 1978, Henry Ford Jr. actually ended up firing him under the premise of he actually just didn't like him. And Lee ends up going to a rival company that same year, and he's hired at Chrysler in that same year and became CEO in 1979. And as part of that reign within Chrysler, he helped really bring the company back from the brink of bankruptcy by convincing the U.S. government that Chrysler was an integral part of the national economy and should be saved. The Treasury Department gave him the requested loan, and Chrysler repaid it quickly and early. And he said, "We at Chrysler borrow money the old-fashioned way. We pay it back," he said in a speech in 1983. And Chrysler's recovery and the advent of the Chrysler minivan really helped cement his legacy as a CEO. He's also well known for leading the creation of the Ford Mustang, which is a widely known car to this day, as well as the original kind of concept and release of the minivan. Again, he took over this kind of floundering Chrysler corporation that he inherited in those late 70s times, and he restored it to a health in what experts call kind of one of the most brilliant turnarounds in business history. And so just to go into, those were a few, I think, the highlights of some of his kind of business decisions and career that led to him being really well known as a leader within these times. But I think in addition to that, as we've highlighted in the past, before we go into a deep dive of mostly the positives, I would say, within his leadership style, I wanted to highlight a little bit of how some of his critics or failures that he encountered throughout his career as well, because I think those, again, also provide valuable lessons as to maybe not what to do, or some other kind of key learnings within there. So one of the greater books from a business history and detail standpoint, I think, is Good to Great by Jim Collins. And he really spent extensive amount of time researching what made companies go from good to great. And it's a great book that really dives into that topic. But within there, he also does, conversely, highlight those scenarios, companies, people that may have fallen short of making that leap. And so really the book kind of profiles people who plan for their own succession. So as we look back on the previous episode with Jack Welch, this again is a common theme of how people's legacy is kind of looked at and looked back on as well, in terms of they may have had great success running the company and as the CEO, but a reflection sometimes of that success is, does the company continue to sustain that success, and do they set the company up well to succeed thereafter, after their departure? And so many executives hold on to the reins and the corresponding perks for too long. Less than great companies have leaders who don't believe the organization can thrive without them. In Jim Collins' book, he talks about Lee, who kept postponing his retirement. The joke at Chrysler was that Iacocca stood for, I am chairman of Chrysler Corporation always. So Collins says that Iacocca held on too long without developing a top-notch replacement. Subsequently, the organization suffered. Conversely, and he has kind of a special term to identify those leaders that have really made the leap from good to great, and so they're kind of called level 5 leaders, are understanding that their run as CEO is not a lifetime gig. So Jim kind of highlights that maybe Lee may have held on for a little bit longer, and then he really didn't take the time towards the end of his reign to identify the right replacement to take over Chrysler. And there's a few other things that throughout the 70s and throughout the auto industry as a whole, Lee had to deal with as well. And so at Chrysler, the root of the problem was that the automaker was not large enough to adequately support 2 dealer networks and 3 brands. So one of the biggest mistakes, arguably, could be that he made when he restructured the corporation following its financial collapse in the late 70s, was to not merge the Chrysler Plymouth and Dodge dealer networks. And it could have allowed him to discontinue the Plymouth brand, which had become redundant with Dodge. And it kind of describes Lee as a meat and potatoes kind of automotive executive. So he was best at squeezing the last drop of profit from evolutionary designs. The downside is that he repeatedly did not adapt quickly enough when the market began to dramatically shift. The key problem maybe wasn't a lack of resources. His fatal flaw could have been that he did not transcend Detroit's bigger, glitzier, more powerful mindset. And so again, I see direct parallels with Welch here in terms of GE, and the company that he wanted to build was one of the times, but arguably he couldn't set the GE to succeed 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the road, and failed to kind of see a lot of these shifts from a technology standpoint. So again, Lee might have been viewed in the same vein. There are smaller other components that you can point to as well within the auto industry that he may have either been too slow to adapt to or not pick up on at all, or maybe have the wrong side of things on. And so from a fuel economy standpoint, beginning in the 1970s, first at Ford and then later at Chrysler, he lobbied against legislation and regulation that would have raised fuel economy standards by cutting back on tailpipe emissions. Like other auto execs, he protested that his industry would go broke or even shut down if forced to obey tough new standards. Well, as we know today, events proved him wrong. Fuel economy has improved dramatically since those early days and continues to do so even as vehicle sales remained strong. He also downplayed the necessity for airbags and other improvements, proclaiming that safety didn't sell. Only when it became clear that safety did sell and that Chrysler was ahead on that score in some of its new vehicles did he begin to tout the new safety features as a competitive advantage. So again, maybe he's a little bit slow in terms of, you see this in car ads today even of, from a consumer standpoint, you really want to be in a car that you feel safe with and that in the event that you're in a crash, you're in a position where the car has good safety ratings. And so he kind of downplayed that, it seemed, in the early days when a lot of this technology was getting developed and implemented in every car. And so he may have been revered as a visionary within the auto industry, but when it comes to the public's health and welfare, he was always looking backwards. And so those are a few things that I found from either a failures and or a criticism standpoint. So again, a few smaller, I'd say, decisions within auto industry specific at that point, and then really looking at when he gave up the realm, and maybe he was a little bit late to do that. His succession within that to set Chrysler up for success was often criticized as well. And so now we're going to get into the main section here, which again is the mantras, philosophies, quotes, and leadership style that Lee exhibited. And I think just to start off here, it seems as though in studying him that the ideals of transformative leadership style, both bold and imaginative qualities, were exhibited. And HBR, Harvard Business Review, kind of refers to him as the first modern example of a charismatic business leader, which is a bold claim to make, but he was really in the public eye and outspoken. So, perhaps he claimed that title, and I think maybe laid the pathway for, this in this day and age. You have, a few other executives. Elon comes to mind and things like that, where it's someone who's very outspoken and really followed within, not only the media, but the public in general. So part of that transformative leadership, I think, that he really honed in on was a key focus on people. So he is quoted in saying, "He hires people brighter than me, and then I get out of their way." And he says all business operations can be reduced down to 3 words: people, product, and profits. People come first. Unless you have that, you won't have a good other 2. And he also says the key to success is not information, it's people. And the kind of people I look for to fill top management spots are the eager beavers. These are the guys who try to do more than they're expected to. They're always reaching out to the people they work with. And so this people aspect eventually gets funneled into one of the bigger kind of leadership pillars and ideals that he forms is the 9 C's of leadership. So I'll just walk through these 9 C's in a quick kind of definition of how he views each of those in the vein of what leadership means to him. And so the first one is just being curiosity, asking questions, listening, and learning. Second is creativity. So going on a limb, trying something different, and thinking outside of the box. 3 is communication, which we'll dive a little bit more into what he means by that. But ultimately, it's the main goal is to talk to people and effectively do that, to do your job. and lead. Fourth is character, so it shows when a leader has the guts to do the right thing. That's what really builds character in his mind. Fifth is conviction, so having a fire in your belly, a passion for both being a leader as well as the industry and business that you're in. Sixth is charisma, so it's a magical quality that inspires people to follow you. Seventh is courage. Eighth, competence, so getting results and fixing problems. And finally, the ninth C of leadership that he identifies is common sense. So he quotes, I think this is one of his mentors, which we'll get into before, but he loves this quote of, if you don't know a dip of horse shit from a dip of vanilla ice cream, you aren't going to make it. So it's common sense, but then also having the street smarts to exceed as a leader. And he thinks that a true leader always thrives to inspire, along with these 9 C's of leadership. A few other quotes here that stuck out to me as well are that the most successful businessman is the man who holds on to the old just as long as it is good and grabs the new just as soon as it gets better. So he demonstrated this ability to embrace the new when he went to Chrysler and oversaw the creation of the minivan, which rolled off the assembly line in 1983 and transformed the world's options for family-oriented transportation. Chrysler was to minivans as minivans were to suburban life in the 1990s. And the cultural impact preserved the company's recovering profits. So, again, this concept that he developed as a product really helped to drive forward Chrysler and lead them into better success. And another quote here is, again, back to the people aspect, is to start with good people, lay out the rules, communicate with your employees, motivate them, and reward them. If you do all those things effectively, you can't miss. So his loyalty to his staff is well documented. In 2008, months before Chrysler and GM declared bankruptcy after years of mounting losses, he visited Auburn Hills and was greeted with thunderous applause by 1,000 Chrysler workers. And he told them, "Don't get panicked. Things are going to be okay. Now is the time to show your stuff. We don't have any alibis. The truth is, automobiles in America are still a vital business." And his energy and power to motivate a crowd are something that we have seen him become a figurehead for the great business leaders in history. And he talks about as a leader, as a boss, and so the speed of the boss is the speed of the team. And he says, if our stockholders had a quarterly review system, why shouldn't our executives? I asked myself. So he began to develop the management system he still uses to this day. And over the years, he's regularly asked his key people, and he's had them ask their key people, and so on down the line, a few basic questions. What are your objectives for the next 90 days? What are your plans, your priorities, your hopes? And how do you intend to go about achieving them? So some simple questions, but I think good ones that just point to asking the right questions is going to get your team to the right ways to look at things and the right answers and things to work on. He also believes, so the one word that makes a good manager, decisiveness. And so to a certain extent, I've always operated by gut feeling. He likes to be in the trenches. I was never one of those guys who could just sit around and strategize endlessly. That's why a certain amount of risk-taking is essential. I realize it's not for everybody. Despite what the textbooks say, most important decisions in corporate life are made by individuals, not by committees. My policy has always been to be democratic all the way to the point of decision. In addition to being decision makers, managers also have to be motivators. And so again, this kind of wrapping up more from a quality sense of highlighting this within 5 different qualities here. That visionary leadership is that he's known for his bold vision and willingness to take risks. And he helps not only turn around Chrysler, but he did some work and had a longer tenure within Ford. And he introduced kind of innovative products and strategies that revitalized them. The strong communication skills, so again, that being one of the C's of communication that he's identified. You see this in a few different forms. He's able to rally his employees and shareholders behind that vision, and he's known for his ability to speak persuasively and inspire others to believe in his ideas. And he's quoted as saying, "I only wish I could find an institution that teaches people how to listen. After all, a good manager needs to listen at least as much as he needs to talk. Too many people fail to realize that real communication goes in both directions." He was also very focused on results. So he's a results-driven leader that set both high standards for himself and his team. He was known for his relentless focus on achieving goals and holding himself and others accountable, as well as having a customer-centric approach. So he understood the importance of meeting the needs of the customers that exceeded their expectations. He introduced, again, those several successful models to this day, the Mustang and the minivan, that appealed to a wide range of customers. And then finally, he kind of emphasized this in building in strong teams, fostering collaboration, and bringing people together from diverse backgrounds and creating a culture of innovation and creativity. And so in looking at a lot of these leadership qualities, it again, as I build a lot of these dots and connect them throughout all the leaders that we study in depth of their leadership styles, as well as some of the decisions or business events that occurred during their careers, I think I see a few parallels as well, not only to Jack Welch, but also to Steve Jobs here. And so in some ways, that idea of bringing iconic brands back from a brink, so being down and being really at the bottom of the depths in terms of the companies that they either inherit or have been a part of, and the ability to turn that around with strong leadership, both of them seem to exhibit. They are also brilliant storytellers and marketers within their products, and then they're both fiercely competitive. So they have really great narrow vision of what they want to accomplish and the leadership principles that they want to instill, not only embody as them as leaders, but then also what they want to see within their teams. And one final kind of quote here was from Denny Pauly. So he was hired and promoted by Iacocca, and he ran all of Chrysler's manufacturing and ultimately transformed the organization through the creation and execution of the Chrysler operating system. So when asked about Lee and what he thought of him as a leader and his time at Chrysler, he said, "I really believe that the name Lee Iacocca is the definition of leadership. He was fearless and never ran from a challenge. Competitors feared him but gave him the respect he deserved. Working for him created lots of tension, but I always knew he was there to pick me up if I fell. He always knew the exact amount of tension to apply without destroying an individual's motivation. I never wanted to fail at anything in my responsibility at Chrysler because I never wanted to disappoint him. He was a role model for me and many others in the industry." So some great, strong, positive words there from a former employee, which is one of many that, you can find in regards to Lee. And I think that word tension is an interesting one of really trying to push at the right times, but not push enough to where people are breaking or people are very turned off by the style that you're trying to implement to get things done. So that's a very hard thing to master, I feel like. But if you have people that succeed and others can look back and really admire that and I think a lot of that too is that they see a lot of the growth and success within themselves is this pressure to succeed and execute their vision. So a great kind of quote to wrap up this leadership style section, which then bleeds into, we have three main mentors and heroes that Lee really looked up to. The first one being Charlie Beecham, which was his first mentor at Ford and the former Ford marketing vice president. And so he taught him the importance of the dealers, and he rubbed his nose in the retail business. And then Lee says, to use everything I learned from my father, from Charlie Beecham, and from my own experience and common sense. If you want to give a man credit, put it in writing. If you want to give him hell, do it on the phone. So Charlie Beecham would preach against trying to be a one-man band. You want to do everything yourself, he used to say. You don't know how to delegate. Now, don't get me wrong. You're the best guy I've got. Maybe you're even as good as two guys put together. So Lee really thought earlier on his career, and for a longer time as well, that Charlie was instrumental in terms of his development. In addition to that, Robert McNamara, which is a Ford whiz kid who became the company's first non-family president, then most people probably know him for being the U.S. Secretary of Defense. And so Lee says, as I learned from McNamara, the discipline of writing something down is the first step toward making it happen. In conversation, you can get away with all kinds of vagueness and nonsense, often without even realizing it. But there's something about putting your thoughts on paper that forces you to get down to specifics. That way, it's harder to deceive yourself or anybody else. And then he kind of sums up both Charlie and Robert taught me advanced business principles, which I applied to my daily executive decisions. And he says, though, the person that influenced him in his life the most was his dad, Nicola Iacocca. And he was the classic example of the way God gives some people more common sense and street smarts than others. I never knew the meaning of the word impossible. It wasn't spoken in our home. And finally, Lee always likes to highlight the great football coach Vince Lombardi. And he admires specific quotes from Vince and was a friend of his as well, in saying that you have to start by teaching the fundamentals. A player's got to know the basics of the game and how to play his position. Next, you've got to keep him in line. That's discipline. The men have to play as a team, not as a bunch of individuals. There's no room for prima donnas. If you're going to play together as a team, you've got to care for one another. You've got to love each other. Each player has to be thinking about the next guy and saying to himself, if I don't block that man, Paul is going to get his legs broken. I have to do my job well in order that he can do this. And so that will wrap up the mentors and heroes section. And I think it's a good place to stop here for episode 4 and Lee Iacocca. Just a tremendous auto executive that had such strong leadership qualities, it seemed, that really resonated, and people remembered him by exemplifying that. And I think a lot of what the leadership that shows through and some of those qualities that he identifies within the 9 C's of leadership are really shown through a larger time period of turnaround. So when the employees and the people of the organization are going through ups and downs and really at a low, and new leadership comes in and is able to instill and inspire and transform a business like that, that is leadership in my mind. And so in really researching and identifying who was a key leader that exemplified this, it seemed as though Lee had this within himself and really exemplified and should be studied more and talked about more as far as someone who was a great leader. And so it was great to dive into Lee here, and we will be back for episode 5 here hopefully soon. Thanks for listening.